Hey folks, and welcome to the Winter Deck Review. I found more to say than usual about the decks this time, so if you like hearing my voice for a longer period of time, cool. If not, I'm not entirely sure why you're here, but I'm glad you are anyway. With that said, let's get into it. To start with, let's talk about Sin Prodigy's Breya deck. This is an Ozolith-centered deck with the goal of flickering modular creatures in order to compound the counters gained by them. At the core of this is two Ozolith-esque effects, as well as three other cards that utilize or amplify counters in some other way. These are used alongside 8 creatures that enter with +1/+1 counters through modular or another mechanic, as well as another 5 cards that also involve 1/1 counters. The idea here is that if these modular creatures enter multiple times, their counters go to Ozolith each time. So, for flickering, this deck has Conjurer's Closet alongside Astral Slide and Astral Drift, and to pair with these two enchantments, there is a card that gives all creature cycling, another card that gives all lands cycling, and 13 other cycling cards. Pairing with these flicker engines are 17 ETB creatures, which perform tasks that range from removing things to tutoring for things to making construct tokens. All of the different elements of the deck are held together by some standard artifact synergies, as well as the deck's fairly versatile artifact ETB-based commander. Between its different packages, this is a deck that is looking to put together an artifact creature-based game plan, with possible pivots into slower and faster playstyles, and beat opponents down over time with an army of growing artifact creatures. This is one of the most ambitious decks I've ever reviewed, and I gotta respect that about it. There are definitely possible synergy threads to be utilized here. Modular is cool with the sacrifice provided by the commander, and is also cool with the Ozolith. The Ozolith is findable by the ETB creature Trinket Mage, and also pairs nicely with other ETB synergies such as that of Surge Conductor. And both Astral Slide and Modular can be used in conjunction with the Graveyard to neat effect. Still, in its current state, I'm worried that this deck isn't going to be able to reach its full potential very often, and will likely fall back onto a more generic artifact game plan rather than its more specific style. I'm going to split this review up into 2 parts. One where I tell you why I think Astral Slide is a bit out of place here, and the other where I give you suggestions for how to move forward if you want to keep it around anyway. Okay, so why don't I like Astral Slide here? Fundamentally, it's a card that demands quite a lot out of your deck in order to be worth running over another flicker engine. I've consistently kept a high 30s count of cycling cards in my Astral Slide deck, and that allows me to get probably an average of 2 triggers per turn cycle once the card is out, with that number typically increasing as I build up card and mana advantage. Meanwhile, with less than half that number of cycling cards here, I think Astral Slide is going to be giving fewer triggers than a teleportation circle, and with significantly more mana spent to get there, since most of the cycling costs are either 2 or 3. There are 2 cards that give other cards cycling in the form of Tectonic Reformation and Ret Tomb Mystic, but if you're using one of these cards, you're spending an extra card for that benefit, and the level of value needed to justify a 2-card cycling-based flicker engine is significantly higher than the amount needed to justify a 1-card cycling-based flicker engine. Your modular Ozolith game plan is already a complicated one with a lot of moving parts, so I don't see this all coming together super often. With that complexity in mind, discrete engines like Soul Herder, Teleportation Circle, and Thassa Deep Dwelling seem like much more reliable options for flickers. Having said all that, I still find the idea of this deck funny, so let's talk about how you could increase the cohesion a bit without cutting any major elements if you wanted to. One clear option is graveyards. I like the inclusion of Oversold Cemetery for allowing reuse of modular creatures, and there are other cards like Scrap Trawler, Felled into the Third Path, and Phyrexian Reclamation that could likewise play into this graveyard theme. I'd also get some extra cycling cards in here. Reconnaissance Mission is an obvious choice paired with the commander's Thopter production. Archfiend of Ifnir can be a big board blowout when you have other cycling cards. Step Through is a better wizard cycling option, and Street Wraith is just kinda always a nice card to have as a free cycle. Finally, there are some extra glue sort of cards that could play a nice role here. Oswald Fiddlebender is a great way to dig into your library. Patrolling Peacemaker is a sort of proliferation that enters with some counters of its own. Mindless Automaton could pair with Ozolith for a boost of extra draw. And Metastatic Evangel is a card that can push out of control fast. As for cuts, I'm not a huge fan of some of the more generic artifact stuff personally. Filigree Angel, Breya's Apprentice, and Sai all feel fairly cuttable. Next up, I want to talk about Leo Dragon's Safana deck. Safana is a commander that grants treasure tokens each turn at end of turn for having the initiative or having completed a dungeon, and she is paired with the background Dungeon Delver, which grants her the ability to double all dungeon rooms. Naturally, the core of this deck is 10 cards that grant the initiative, as well as another 3 cards that venture into the dungeon. The initiative is definitely the stronger mechanic of these two, since it continually triggers a bit like the Monarch, but with the abilities doubled, it's hard to feel too bad about a little dungeon venturing. The initiative naturally works well with cards that allow a player to get in for damage, so a big part of this deck ends up being evasive creatures like Baleful Strix, Shadow Mage Infiltrator, and Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel. These work well alongside a number of combat damage effects in the deck, such as Grim Hireling, or one of the 5 Biden of Thassa style effects that the deck is packing. Capping off the deck is a light flicker package, which includes 2 instant flickers and 2 flicker engines, along with the ETB component of 9 creatures that do something dungeon related when they enter, as well as another 5 that do something else. Between these different options, this deck looks like it's trying to build a significant amount of value through a variety of means, while whittling down opposing life totals with its evasive creatures. Generally, this looks solid. The command zone is a nice combination of a value amplifier and a mana granting payoff, and the 98 features a whole lot of resource generation in the form of draw and ramp, which seems like it should help this deck keep chugging along smoothly. The evasive creatures here are a nice way to take back the initiative, and though this deck doesn't seem full of tools to keep it, the fact that you're hopefully getting twice as many triggers as opponents makes that fact seem fine enough. I even think the flicker inclusion here is pretty sweet, as it can offer quite a lot of advantage with the full command zone plus an initiative creature in play. With that said, my first thought here was, could the deck be using Safana's end-step treasures more effectively? Treasures are obviously pretty nice in general, and a 3-mana commander that grants 3 mana per turn at full power is certainly far from bad purely as a mana tool, but treasures are also uniquely potent in a couple of other ways. One of these is that they're artifacts, and given the already high count of mana rocks, that could be a neat synergy package to try out, but that'd be a pretty substantially different deck. Another, probably more relevant feature of treasures here is that they enable instant speed plays well since they're stored mana that's never wasted, and for that reason I wouldn't mind seeing a little more instant speed stuff here. There are a couple ETB creatures that remove things here, and replacing these with flash options such as Urtai Resurrected or Calidus Assassin seems like it could keep the flicker synergies while allowing the deck to be a bit more spry. I personally would also run more counterspells in general. Foil is one I'm a fan of since the initiative will likely already leave you with some islands in hand, and some pricier counters like Desertion or Sublime Epiphany could likewise be fun for holding up with treasure mana. Leo Dragon also mentioned that closing out games can be a little tricky sometimes. In part, this might be fixable through the deck's interaction suite. This is already a deck that can build in value, and if you're able to prolong the period of time where you're in a dominant position by packing more removal, that might be enough all on its own. Still, let's talk about some other endgame tools. Since you have 2 commanders, one solid option could be Commander Storm cards. Skullstorm, Thunderclap Drake, and my personal favorite, Echo Storm. Just on your side of the board, you could copy Conjurer's Closet for massive flicker value, you could copy Saravok's Tome for a bunch of initiative triggers, and if you swap your Mind Stone for a Liquid Metal Torque, the options get even juicier. I like that the Commander Storm options scale with losing your commanders, as it helps them to be somewhat of an insurance policy against drawn-out, high-attrition games. Moving in a somewhat different direction, another finisher card I used in a Dimir Evasive Dudes deck a while back is Notorious Throng. That deck was a full rogue deck, but this deck at least has a rogue in the command zone with a kinda evasive keyword, so I could still see it working out. One final option as a play extender of sorts could be Savor the Moment, as it pairs nicely with the initiative mechanic to grant an extra trigger, as well as with the end of turn treasures the commander provides. Moving right along, the next deck I want to discuss is Gleaming Moonlight's Tormod deck. Tormod is a partner commander who generates a zombie creature token whenever one or more cards leave his controller's graveyard, and he is paired here with Dargo the Shipwrecker. I'm not even sure you need to know what Dargo does for the sake of this deck, as this deck contains 2 red symbols, which makes me think that casting Dargo isn't a very big part of the deck's game plan. What is a big part of the deck's game plan is recur to hand engines, with the deck containing 2 creatures that recur themselves to hand repeatedly, as well as 5 permanents that recur other creatures to hand over time. These 7 are joined by 8 other cards that trigger Tormod in some way, for a grand total of 15. To enable this recursion to zombies loop, the deck also features a number of cards that sacrifice creatures, as well as cards that allow a player to discard other cards to perform effects. Both of these work well with cards that loop creatures from the graveyard to hand over time, and this deck doubles down on the discard subtheme by running 9 Madness cards, allowing for an additional source of value. Overall, this deck is looking to build a board of zombies through Tormod, generating a solid quantity of graveyard-based value in the meantime, before eventually whittling down opponents. For starters, I'll say that a lot of parts of this game plan seem solid. There are a lot of creatures that can pitch themselves via a cycling ability, and this could pretty easily set up a value loop of some sort that could trigger Tormod. The inclusion of some sacrifice stuff also gives a thing you can do with the zombies Tormod creates, as well as an additional way to put cards into the graveyard. In addition, between its different methods, this deck ends up packing a lot of interaction for opposing threats, which will be nice for its grindier game plan. Still, I'm left with some questions looking at this deck, a big one being, why is Dargo here? The answer isn't Dargo himself, since the deck runs very few red sources, and it also isn't really for colors. The only red card in the 98 is Squee, which is a nice card for this sort of deck, but it's not insanely good or anything as just one single card in the whole deck. Looking at the other partner options, Dargo is about on par with the rest of the red partners in how helpful it is to this deck, but there are multiple black partners that seem like they could be really helpful if you were willing to cut red. Keskit is a nice value engine, Nadier is a cool top-end threat, Armrix is a discard source that also becomes a removal engine with treasures in play, and my favorite is Tevesh Zat, which packs a ton of utility in a token deck like this. I'd say if you're looking to power this deck up and make it more reliable, getting more use out of the command zone is a great first step. And I get the sense that the stuff you enjoy about this deck is the Tormod graveyard looping stuff, rather than the sorts of combo-y plays that Dargo thrives at. It's also probably possible to hone this deck's synergies a bit, even outside the command zone. There are some other areas where the deck seems like it's including either cards I would consider filler, or cards that aren't supported that strongly in terms of synergy. One of these is the deck's discard package. There are 9 Madness cards here, including some like Murderous Compulsion and Grave Scrabbler that really aren't very good when they're not being Madness cast. But at the same time, there are only 7 cards in this deck that discard other cards. All of those cards are pretty solid, and you have plenty of other ways to utilize cards in the graveyard, but I'd guess that the minor value benefits from the Madness cards probably don't outweigh the cost of running kinda mediocre cards, so I'd probably cut most of them. I'm also interested by the number of sacrifice effects this deck currently includes. Tormod produces sack fodder pretty readily, so anything that sacrifices for a major benefit is probably going to be worth it, but what I'm not so sure about is some of the weaker sack outlets. Does this deck want creatures to die enough to justify running Carrion Feeder, Umbral Caller Zealot, and Voldaren Pariah? There are 3 other cards that draw when your creatures die, but that's it in terms of aristocracy stuff, and one of those 3 even specifies non-token. So I don't really see these feeling good in the current form of this deck, but they might feel good if you add some more creature death effects, which I would probably do regardless. Liliana Dreadhorde General and Dark Prophecy are both great draw engines, and if you're feeling spicy, you could toss in Grave Pact and or Dictate of Erebos as well. If you're looking for more ways to trigger these, you could also add some of the black creatures that recur themselves, the strongest of which for this deck would be Gravecrawler. There will still be some vulnerability to Graveyard Hate if you focus more on creatures dying, but it will be significantly less vulnerability than focusing on looping creatures as your primary value generation method. Alrighty, the next deck I want to talk about is Soviet Dalek's Ardenn Vial Smasher Politics deck. Vial Smasher is a partner commander who causes your first spell each turn to deal its mana value in damage to a random opponent, but the more important partner for this deck is Ardenn. He attaches any number of equipment and auras to a permanent of your choice at the start of combat, and relevantly for this deck, he can attach things to your opponent's creatures. Those creatures could pose a threat to you, which is why one thing this deck has is 5 auras that goad the creature they're attached to. Another thing Ardenn seems likely to be attaching is Sunforger, an equipment that allows its controller to unattach it from a creature it's on to cast a red or white instant of mana value 4 or less from their library. In this deck, that selection of cards is 4 conventional removal spells, 2 counter spells, 9 cards with some sort of fog-adjacent effect, and 6 other cards with a veritable mishmash of different effects. A number of instants here are deflecting palm-style cards that can flip around the damage of a big attacker, and these seem nice for later in the game when there's just one player left. Finally, to hold this deck together, there are 8 tutors, 5 of which are equipment tutors to find Sunforger, and the other 3 of which are more versatile black tutors. Overall, this seems like a fun deck. I always love attaching equipments to opposing creatures, and pairing this with the Goad enchantments is kinda clever. I also think that running Vial Smasher as the partner is a really nice idea, as it offers a source of damage to whittle down opponents in what otherwise might be a kinda techy and unreliable damage plan. It also pairs nicely with the instant speed nature of this deck, since Vial Smasher can trigger on opposing turns as well. I can also tell that some thought has been put into the weaknesses of an Aikido-style deck, such as the endgame scenario. Still, I can see a couple areas where this deck could certainly be improved. One big thing I notice is that the equipment count of this deck seems very low, and I'm kinda curious why, as that seems like a potentially extremely useful card type. There are 3 equipments aside from Sunforger, and these seem fine enough, particularly Assault Suit, but with this deck's number of equipment tutors, it seems like you could probably go a bit heavier here. Argentum Armor is an equipment-based removal engine that can also pair nicely with Goad for a more controlling game plan, but I think you could also go much simpler and toss good old Colossus Hammer in here. One weakness of this deck is that the deflecting palm style cards don't do a whole lot if your opponent's creatures are small, and giving a way to make them a whole lot bigger seems like it'd significantly increase the utility of those cards. As of present, I'm a little leery of the total count of these sort of reactive Aikido instants, given that this is a Sunforger deck that theoretically has decent access to the whole library, but that count makes more sense if these can deal enough damage to be a consistent endgame plan. Another thing that could be added here is some general utility equipments. Soviet Dalek mentioned that the early game feels clunky sometimes with this deck, and to some extent that's probably inevitable given the later game focused command zone and high number of specific cards present. Still, something you could try adding might be some ramp equipments like Sword of the Animist and Bitterthorn. These can be put on your creatures to ramp, and they can also be put on opposing creatures to ramp you, since the ability is on the equipment rather than the creature. This won't improve the first 3 turns of the game much, but the extra ramp will definitely start to show on turns 4 through 6. Interestingly, at present this actually doesn't seem like a very mana-hungry deck. Sunforger can eat up a bit of mana, but you're already cheating the equip cost on it presumably, and with this deck's low quantity of draw, low to moderate mana costs, and density of highly situational cards, I just don't see more mana being consistently useful. If the current low draw, high tutor approach feels good, then that's all good and fine. It could be worth adding a bit more draw to smooth things out. Admittedly, the options for this among Sunforger castable cards aren't amazing, but you could try an equipment like Mask of Memory or Sword of Fire and Ice as a somewhat different approach. The next deck I want to talk about is Stygia Azalea's Kykar control deck. Kykar is a Jeskai commander that creates a spirit when his controller casts a non-creature spell, and which can also sacrifice a spirit to add a red mana. What might a person want to cast with a lot of red mana? How about Worldfire? This deck runs 2 other Worldfire analogs, World Purge and Sway of the Stars, though calling them World Purge analogs could be a little misleading, because the situation that each of these 3 cards produce can be quite a lot different from one another. More on that later. What these 3 cards have in common is that they remove all graveyards, hands, and boards, returning the game to a sort of primordial early game situation, and this can be taken advantage of with mechanics that leave cards in exile, such as Plot. Plotted cards are paid for first and cast later, making them perfect for a situation where you have mana now, but won't have it later. The deck contains 10 cards that either have Plot or give other cards Plot, as well as another 4 cards with Suspend, and 2 cards with Adventure. The ultimate goal is to get some number of these into exile before casting one of the big reset cards, and then leveraging the plotted or suspended cards into a win from there. Naturally, this leaves some critical moments of vulnerability, and to deal with that, this deck runs a fair amount of protection, mostly in the form of counterspells and Abolisher-style cards to prevent opposing counterspells. Rounding out the deck are a few board wipes and a handful of defensive cards, which can hopefully buy this deck enough time to set up a clean win. So, this deck is very cool. Decks based around a big reset card like Worldfire can be a little tricky to make feel satisfying and non-gimmicky since a core aspect is resetting the game, but this deck looks like it has a better shot of threading that needle than most. In fact, this deck's play pattern seems similar to a traditional control deck in a lot of ways. In my mind, a core aspect of control is the 2 decisions of what threats are worth targeting down and when to deploy a big game warping card like a board wipe. You might assume control decks just want to counter everything and remove everything, but in fact a big piece of them is trying to get away with not removing things for as long as possible in order to spend more time building resources, and hit more things with an eventual board wipe. With this in mind, a core pillar of this deck looks to be waiting as long as possible to cast the big reset card, so that as many cards as possible can be set up to assist with winning afterward. Broadly, this deck looks pretty capable of doing that, but there are some elements of this deck I'm not quite so sure about. One of these is the spirit-oriented cards in the deck. Some of these I don't mind. The instant-speed ones, like Release to Memory and Benevolent Offering, seem nice as a thing that can be weaved onto an end step on a turn cycle where a counter wasn't necessary. However, others seem notably less useful. Creatures don't get you a spirit with Kykar, so Doomed Traveler and Clarion Spirit seem probably not worth it just as a source of mana and blockers, and I'm really at a loss for why Ruin Ghost is here, outside of the singular use case of flipping a Mystic Peak into a Pinnacle Monk. As for what you should be focusing on instead in your pre-reset turns, there are some different options. A more board wipe heavy version of things might be better if you struggle to keep Kykar on board, and you could actually combine this with some protection for Kykar in the form of exile and return at end step cards like Getaway Glamour, since these have added utility in conjunction with one of the reset cards later in the game. Another option would be to go for more one-sided and stalling sort of cards if you want to preserve more of the spirits. Mass Calcify, Aether Spouts, maybe even some more defensive permanents. I think it's also interesting to think about the endgame plan with the plot cards. Something a little intriguing about this deck is that the plotted cards you'd want for different reset cards are actually very different, I think. If we're talking Worldfire, Slickshot Show-Off and Cunning Coyote are ideal to finish off your 1-health opponents with their haste. On the other end of things, World Purge doesn't do anything to life totals, so with that you'd want bigger threats or value engines currently in exile. What is optimal really depends on which of these was cast, but there are 3 cards I don't care for in any situation. The 2 adventure cards, and Sheriff of Safe Passage. The adventure effects are okay, but not great, and having an extra castable vanilla creature doesn't impress me much. Likewise, Sheriff of Safe Passage just seems like it'd be a small to medium-sized vanilla creature after a reset, which will be passable with Worldfire, but actively not very good with the other 2. There are also a few other plot cards and suspend cards you could consider adding. The card Suspend itself could be nice as another way to keep the commander around after a reset, as well as being a piece of removal in a pinch. Taigam Master Opportunist could also be nice as a card that suspends that's a bit less telegraphed than some of the other suspend cards, since spells will be getting suspended regardless of any active effort. Finally, Highway Robbery could be nice as a filtering spell that could also give a little boost of value after a reset. Pivoting to a different Jeskai deck, I want to talk about Math Blitz's Toolbox Artifact deck. The commander of this deck is Inspirit Flagship Vessel, which is a station that puts a +1/+1 counter or 2 charge counters onto another artifact at the start of your combat, and which can be upgraded to give your other artifacts hexproof and indestructible. Naturally, this deck contains 22 artifact creatures, 9 of which are 2-cost cards that can offer a nice curve out into the commander. To go along with this sort of aggressive plan, this deck contains a number of pretty aggressive cards that seem intended to knock down opposing life totals. This includes low-cost options like Mendicant Core and Dowsing Device, as well as top-end cards such as Depth Shaker Titan and Cyberdrive Awakener that animate artifacts. However, this beatdown package is only part of this deck, with another major element being its toolbox components and later game engines. Repurposing Bay and Oswald Fiddlebender allow sacrificing artifacts to find higher cost artifacts, and there are also a few tutors that can find either of these cards. Some funky situational artifacts that these are likely to search up might be Salvaging Station, Filigree Angel, Vidalcan Orrery, or Krenko's Buzzcutter. Throughout the deck, there are a lot of cards that either care about or help create a large board of artifacts, and the deck will likely be looking to win through some mixture of go-wide tactics, assisted by the commander's protection. So overall, this deck includes a fun mix of different themes. There are a lot of different elements here, but they do all work toward a sort of go-wide artifact plan in some way or other. I think it's also fun that this deck's toolbox plan can let it flex between slower and faster options. Like, if you're grabbing a 5-cost artifact, you can choose between Alibu and Cataclysmic Gearhulk, and if you're grabbing a 6-cost artifact, you can choose between Cyberdrive Awakener and Planetarium of Wan Shi Tong. This deck also has a very diverse interaction suite that's well coordinated and ties into its various synergies throughout the deck, which should help it to weather some challenges. With all that said, this deck unfortunately does still strike me as a bit unfocused, which will hurt its ability to perform consistently well game to game. The biggest area where this is true is in terms of the speed of this deck's game plan, because to me it's kind of unclear how fast this deck is really trying to be. Now, that isn't always a bad thing. My most played deck is a center-of-the-road mid-range deck that can kind of pivot faster or slower depending on what the game state demands, and that is a good feature for a deck to have. So what I mean when I say this deck's speed is unclear is that it's running cards that I would expect from a dedicated aggro deck and cards I would expect from a dedicated control deck, and cards which might struggle to find a place in the other playstyle. On the surface, this looks like a faster deck, with a somewhat more aggressive commander and cards like Surginder and Mendicant Core that don't have much of a place in a control deck. However, there are also cards like Filigree Angel, Salvaging Station, Vidalcan Orrery, and Gilded Lotus that you really wouldn't want to draw in any halfway aggressive deck. This problem is likely worsened by this deck's sources of value, most of which are one-time use, which doesn't necessarily bode well for good scaling. Among the 6 value engines, there are some standout options like Insight Engine and Mystic Forge, which seem quite potent, but there are others like Salvaging Station and Scrap Trawler which generally want a more specific playstyle, and which could easily end up dead in hand with the wrong draws. Now, I just said a bunch of critical stuff about this deck, but in reality, I still really like the project of making a sort of flexible toolbox deck, and I think it could work out. The thing to keep in mind will be that Toolbox as a strategy naturally leans toward control. If the toolboxy stuff is what you really enjoy about this deck, it could be worth leaning into that, adding a flicker package, maybe even swapping commander. However, if you're wanting to stick closer to the undeniably cool, full archetype spectrum toolbox approach you're on at the moment, I'd tweak the deck in a couple key ways. For one, you might want to consider cutting some of the cards on the fringes of the archetypes that aren't as flexible. For early game cards, this might be Arcbound Ravager and Surginger, and for later game cards, this might be some of the bigger mana rocks like the Eternity Elevator that don't currently have things they're clearly ramping into. The other change worth making is getting more filtering and more flexible draw in here to try and smooth over some of the challenges in having such a wide-ranging deck. Mechan Navigator could be a filtering source that curves nicely into the commander, and Unctus could be a nice filtering source that's also an artifact lord. For draw, I'd try out some engines like Joyra, Vidalcan Archmage, or Emry that don't demand as much in terms of synergy, and scale better than some of the other stuff you have at the moment. Also, not a value engine, but the Sarima seems killer here. A tutor for Oswald that also serves as late-game protection for your commander, sort of like a build-your-own Avacyn type thing. Speaking of sweet 8-mana cards, the next deck I want to talk about is Big Nonsense's Marvo Control deck. Marvo is a 5-mana 1/8 octopus guy who clashes with the defending player when he attacks, meaning you both reveal the top card of your library and see who has the higher one. And he also has the line of text that when you win a clash, you draw a card and then get to cast a spell from your hand for free. Naturally, this deck is loaded up with bombs for Marvo to cheat out this way, with 14 cards in this deck being either 7 or 8 mana. A lot of these are pretty classic high-cost spells. Aminadu's Augury, Breach the Multiverse, One with the Multiverse, and Hullbreaker Horror. There are also some spicy ones though, such as Myojin of Cryptic Dreams, which can copy a permanent spell 3 times, and a few beatdown threats I'll touch more on in a moment. To help get the right things on top of library, this deck also features 9 cards that perform some sort of effect to order things on top of library, whether that be surveilling, tutoring, or something else. Holding down the control game plan is a handful of value engines, 6 counterspells, some single target removal, and some bombs that help slow opponents down. An interesting final inclusion is some options for draining out opponent, which include a few life loss amplifying demons, as well as a couple others that themselves push life loss. So this is a neat take on Marvo. A lot of what's here is pretty classic high-cost blue and black cards, but there are also some spicy inclusions like Vesuvan Drifter, Ancient Cellar Spawn, Liliana Vess, and Scheming Symmetry. I also briefly checked out the EDH page, and I'm genuinely shocked that less than 10% of Marvo decks run Varigoth. That card seems like an incredible inclusion here. This deck's ratios of bombs, draw, top of library manipulation, and interaction also look pretty solid, and the support cards seem likely to help produce a decently smooth game plan. My one initial concern might be making sure that Marvo doesn't get hated out too much, but this deck is packing a moderate amount of protection and counterspells, which should hopefully help with that. With that said, I'm going to jump right into the goals Big Nonsense mentioned having for this deck, with that being keeping up at bracket 4 tables while maintaining a suite of demon-oriented life loss cards as the primary win cons. Ancient Cellar Spawn, which drains opponents equal to the difference if a spell costs less to cast than its base mana value, was specifically mentioned as a favorite card here. With these goals in mind, my first thought here is that this might be a tricky pairing of things to pull off. Can you build a Marvo Bracket 4 deck? Absolutely. For the easiest route, throwing in the Shuffle In extra turn spells, Beacon of Tomorrows and Nexus of Fate, would immediately produce a 1-card infinite combo with Varigoth and the Commander, as well as offering some non-infinite turn chaining plays with some of the other top-of-library tutors. You could also add in some other control bombs like Nezahal, Jin-Gitaxia's Progress Tyrant, and Sphinx of the Second Sun for some added tempo swings off of Marvo. Next question. Could you make a Bracket 4 deck based around damage amplifier demons like Sower of Discord and Bloodletter Vaclazots? Also yes, these are going to be sweet top-end plays in a deck whose core game plan deals a lot of damage, and these are the perfect sort of amplifiers to take a deck from moderately threatening to ending the game in short order. With that said, combining damage amplifier demons with a controlling Marvo plan seems a little tricky, because the base level of damage being put out just isn't that high. Marvo is a 1-power creature, and while most of the creatures that might be cheated out are 6 to 8 power, if you land a damage doubler the following turn, you're looking at making a single player lose maybe like 16 life, let's say. Now, this deck does have several clones in it, so maybe you cheat out a Hoarding Broodlord one turn, cheat out an Archfiend of Despair the following turn, clone that Archfiend on the second main phase, and drain an opponent for 28 over the course of the turn. That's getting into decent amounts of explosiveness, but with that level of setup, it's almost like we're creating a combo whose payoff is a pretty solid, but possibly not lethal, amount of damage to one single player. Ditto for Ancient Cellar Spawn plays. If you cast an 8-drop for free with a Cellar Spawn in play, you get to drain an opponent for 8. That's a fair amount of damage coming off of a 3-mana creature, but it's also the equivalent of swinging in with a decently big attacker, and even with an amplifier, it's just not that fast a clock. Now, to be clear, Bracket 4 is a somewhat diverse place in my experience. The fastest decks will be consistently comboing off by turn 5, while the slower decks might just be well-tuned mid-range that will sometimes explode out of control with the right draws. And what distribution of those you encounter will depend a lot on the environment you're in and the people you're playing with. With that in mind, if Ancient Cellar Spawn plays are what you really enjoy about this deck, I'd say you have two options. Option 1 is that you make this a bracket 3 deck, which is honestly where the card realistically belongs. Add some tasty demons you like, maybe throw in something like a Keen Duelist or a Hidetsugu and Kairi that double down on the life drain plan a bit, and don't worry so much about top quality bombs and tempo plays. Option 2 is you're looking for a challenge, and you build a bracket 4 Ancient Cellar Spawn deck anyway. For this, my advice is simple. Slow down the pace of the game a bit. More counterspells, maybe some stacks like God Pharaoh's Statue, Ward of Bones, Arcane Laboratory, or Jin-Gitaxia's Progress Tyrant, as well as maybe some cheat targets for Marvo like Cityscape Leveler or Blatant Thievery that also slow opponents down. You still might get outsauced some games, but getting outsauced is just a part of life, and you'll be gemming with a funky tree monster guy as consolation. Keeping things in the realm of control, the next deck I want to talk about is Spartan 101-600's Extus deck. The aforementioned Extus is a 4-mana Mardu commander who brings a non-legendary creature from graveyard back to hand whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell. To pair with Extus, this deck has 11 creatures that put themselves in the graveyard, of which 3 are land cyclers, 3 generate card advantage, 4 are removal, and 1 is a fog. The deck also has 7 cards that discard, mill, or tutor to graveyard, and between these and the creatures that dump themselves into the yard, there's a decent number of ways to fill up the graveyard. Once the creatures are there, that's where this deck's 36 instants and sorceries kick in to get them out. Most of these perform the task of removing something or defending against attacks, and actually the deck has a pretty even split of these, 19 of each. For closing out the game, the deck has some options to reanimate opposing creatures, a big creature of its own in the form of Sarah's Emissary, some light incremental damage sprinkled throughout the instants and sorceries, and the card Professor Onyx that drains opponents whenever you cast instants or sorceries. Broadly, I can appreciate this creature looping focused version of Extus. I enjoy a lot of the creature choices, as they seem well picked to slow opponents down and build up in value. This deck also has a pretty nice removal suite overall, with a wide range of different answers and a lot of options available at instant speed. This deck also has a very robust land count, with a number of MDFCs as well as 3 land cycling creatures, and land cycling creatures work quite well with Extus to offer a continued source of land drops where necessary. So that's what I like here. In terms of what I dislike here, there are 2 issues I see. Issue number 1 is that there are way too many defensive cards here, a whole 19. Spartan mentioned in their deck summary that they built this in part to utilize fogs, and to some extent I can understand this. Fogs and other defensive tools can be nice in moderation for a grindy late game deck, and there are some options here I quite like, such as Kamiya False Hope and Prismatic Strands. However, the total number here is simply too high, and some of them seem actively pretty bad. I've never been convinced by Norn's Decree as a defensive tool in a deck without proliferation, and I'm even less convinced by Sphere of Safety in a deck with 3 other enchantments. Part of my issue here is that defensive cards are delaying tools above all else, but it's kind of unclear to me what this deck with a ton of delaying tools is delaying until. One option for a control deck could be a board wipe, like you give your opponents longer to accumulate stuff before nuking it all, but there's only one board wipe in this deck. Another option here could be delaying until you can take control of the game in some way, or deal enough damage to your opponents, but this brings me to my second issue here. I don't really see the endgame plan. This deck is pretty light on win cons. In principle, this might not be the end of the world if you're running with a well-crafted control suite that will surge in power over time, and this deck does have plenty of removal. However, as Spartan identified in their list of goals here, this deck's late-game value generation seems like it could run into some issues. Part of that is simply that there's not a whole lot of it in the 99, just a handful of value engines along with a couple instants and sorceries. I imagine this is because the commander does that job here, and Extus is a source of value in the command zone, in the sense that it can let you loop a creature repeatedly, which is undoubtedly useful. However, this isn't a source of value that will scale very well, since mana limitations will continue to exist, and it also doesn't dig you further into your deck to find the things you might need to win. As a result, it seems difficult to scale up the deck's value and removal to really take over a game like you'd want in a hardcore control deck. Where I'd start here is by replacing some of the defensive cards with some card draw. This will make the deck more fluid to play in general, and replacing a plentiful type of card with more draw usually feels okay, since draw ups your chances of finding that thing. Morbid Opportunist is a nice value engine for this sort of deck, and you could also go with Magecraft triggering options such as Painful Truths, Night's Whisper, and Circle of Power. If you wanted to dial in on a couple more synergistic options, Primal Amulet and Pyromancer's Goggles will let you get more out of your spells, and you could even add a card like Ranger of Eos or Starfield Shepherd that can find one of your high-quality 1-drops. Since one of these is Kamiya False Hope, this could also help mitigate the feeling of having fewer fogs. Some combination of these additions would likely be a good starting point for establishing late game dominance more effectively, but there are plenty of other things you could try as well. Something like Monastery Mentor as a heavier duty win con, a higher utility removal spell like Hurl Through Hell or Aloran's Searing Light, or even some light flicker in the form of Ephemerate or Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Alright, we've had a whole lot of Jeskai and Mardu and Dimir and whatnot so far, so let's take a pivot and finish up with a couple green decks. The next deck I want to talk about is Ha-He-Ho's Karlach bracket 4 aggro deck. This deck's creature commander is Karlach, a 5-mana creature who gives an additional combat after your first combat each turn, and she's paired with the background of Hardy Outlander, which lets a commander buff another creature equal to their power and toughness when the commander attacks the highest health opponent. This deck is then all about using that stuff to smash opponents to pieces in short order. This starts with a whole bunch of acceleration cards, which include some mana dorks, a couple pretty conventional options, and then a fair amount of stuff that also helps during the beatdown phase of things, such as Professional Facebreaker, Goreclaw, Ruby, and Selvala. Also, a Gaia's Cradle, because this is a proxy-friendly deck. Among the base of beaters, there's a lot of on-attack triggers. Some of these create mana, which can then go infinite with Hellkite Charger or Aggravated Assault, and others do something like delaying damage or pumping up the size of the board. There's also some draw engines such as Toski, as well as some token copy generators, which can then go infinite with Combat Celebrant or Port Raiser. Rounding out the deck is some haste enablers, some other extra combat enablers, and a light to moderate sprinkling of both protection spells and ways to interact with opposing plays. So generally, I like the look of this quite a bit. I have a Hardy Outlander background deck as one of my less played decks, and the idea of pairing that with extra combats is pretty mouthwatering for sure. The balance of different resources here seems mostly pretty good, with about the right balance of ramp, draw, protection, and removal on the first glance. Obviously, I can't know that for sure without seeing the sorts of decks opponents will be playing and seeing things in action, but the numbers here are about what I'd expect for this sort of deck. There are also lots of interesting synergy threads weaved throughout this very aggressive game plan, which I can appreciate. So let's talk about the problems and conundrums Ha-He-Ho mentioned having here. One of these is that the deck draws a lot of heat. Basically, it swings hard for a bit, but then gets shut down by opponents. I do fully believe that this deck attracts a lot of heat, since extra combats alongside buffing makes for a terrifying existential threat for opponents. However, in principle, I feel like this issue should be somewhat mitigated by the sheer brutality of the game plan. Like, Ha-He-Ho mentioned that this deck hits hard for 1 or 2 rounds before being shut down, but if you get 2 turns of swinging in with this, I feel like there should be at least one downed opponent, and at least one other at a dangerously low life total. Now, in fairness, there are some potential reasons why things could work out this way. One is that Hardy Outlander encourages a little bit of damage spreading, since it doesn't trigger unless you attack the highest health opponent with the commander, and though that might only be 5 damage per combat, that will still be a factor. You also might get something removed and hit for less than you might have otherwise. Finally, there could be a playstyle factor here. I probably wouldn't start going all in until I thought I had a solid chance of knocking a player out that turn, and if you start swinging too early, you could do a bunch of scary damage without meaningfully reducing your opponent's ability to gang up on you. Regardless of what is causing the deck to fall flat sometimes, I have some ideas for how to improve things. For one, I kinda wonder if more haste enablers would help here, because that feels like a thing you'd basically always want. In a low to medium value deck, every haste enabler is taking up some valuable space. I think you could get away with adding Hall of the Bandit Lord and or Handwear Battlements, as well as probably Lightning Greaves to add a bit of protection as well. This might occasionally block abilities targeting your commander or other key creatures you equip to, but I imagine that'll be worth it for both extra haste and extra protection. In terms of other things that might help with beats, this deck seems like it'd go kinda crazy with Wild Beastmaster, since you can order the triggers so that Beastmaster gets Outlander buffed and then gives your other creatures +6/+6. Ouroboros is another card I saw mentioned as a possible option in the description of the deck, and that one seems pretty solid as well, though not quite as disgusting with Beastmaster if you have the commanders out, since it triggers before Karlach can buff it on the first combat. There are similar cards like Pathbreaker Ibex and Cultivator Blades that cost a bit more mana, and it's up to you whether that's worth it for this effect. I lean toward probably not, but they're out there. Another thing you could try to smooth this deck out a bit is adding cards like Kami of Whispered Hopes and Heron Blade Elite that create mana of any color equal to their power. These will be mediocre mana dorks early, and they'll also be play extenders in longer turns, also getting much better the more extra combat spells you add that cast second main phase and untap your creatures. And they also go infinite with Aggravated Assault. Speaking of which, let's talk about the combos here. I like Aggravated Assault quite a bit, as it's a very flexible card in general, in addition to being easily the best combo enabler here. I also don't hate Hellkite Charger, though I'm kinda curious how it's been feeling. It seems pretty mana expensive, being 13 mana to hit the first extra combat rather than 8, but maybe it works out. With regard to token copy combos, my feelings are likewise mixed. Rionia seems pretty solid, and Deline seems passable, and it's nice that both of these can attack and then be untapped by Karlach. On the other hand, Kiki Jiki just feels clunky here, to be honest, even without considering the triple red cost in a green-heavy deck. I have to imagine if there's something better that can be done with that deck space. Part of me wonders if Fable of the Mirror Breaker would be an okay replacement. Obviously it sucks as a top deck, and the infinite combo potential is substantially less, but the added utility is nice, and honestly, you might not even need more than 2 or 3 extra combats off of Combat Celebrant to seal the deal on a lot of board states. The final deck I want to talk about is Jelly Roll 153's Mono Green Bobble deck. The commander here is Six, a 3-mana 2/4 who, on attack, mills 3 cards and puts a land from them into your hand, and who more importantly gives all non-land cards in your graveyard Retrace. This line of text is used in conjunction with low-cost cards that tutor for lands in order to rapidly cast spells and rapidly accumulate lands in graveyard. And to be clear, when I say rapidly cast spells, that is the payoff. Spells being cast. A central card in this deck is Traveler's Amulet, along with its many analogs. So what happens is you cast Traveler's Amulet, crack it to find a forest, cast it again with Retrace by discarding that forest, and rinse and repeat as many times as you feel like spending the mana for. There are 5 cost reducers for artifacts in the deck to reduce the mana cost of the artifact to 0, which means that you then end up only needing to pay a single mana for the ability cost for each loop, rather than paying 2 mana. As far as payoffs go, some of it is lands in graveyard payoff, as you'd expect. Aftermath Analyst can bring back all of those tasty graveyard forests to play, Groundskeeper can bring them back to hand to retrace other cards, and Rumbleweed's cost is reduced by all of those lands in graveyard. Other payoffs include Chatterstorm and Ave Progenitor Ooze as storm cards, as well as Summoning Station to create 2/2 creatures when artifacts are put into graveyard, and Monument to Endurance to have various effects for the first 3 cards discarded each turn. Between these different payoffs, this deck is likely looking to assemble a wide board before eventually going for the kill. If you can't tell, I kinda adore this deck concept. It's a very clever usage of 6, and also an extremely fair one. If this wasn't a mono-green deck, it could easily be a lot less fair, since you're basically able to discard cards and cast non-creature spells equal to the amount of mana you have each turn, with relatively easy setup. Toss a Glinthorn Buccaneer, a Surly Badgesaur, a Monastery Mentor, or a Displacer Kitten in the mix, and you have the potential for some nasty stuff to go down. But green's payoffs for discarding and artifact spellcasting just aren't all that great, which makes things a lot more interesting. This deck currently packs some number of payoffs, and actually a pretty fun variety among them. I like that there are discard payoffs and permanent sacrifice payoffs and spellcasting payoffs and lands in graveyard payoffs, and I think that diversity further serves to pump up the fairness of this deck. In part, I say that because I think if you were trying to make this deck as strong as possible, you'd probably stick mostly to the lands in graveyard payoffs, since that's what green thrives at most in this whole equation. Lumra, Icedale Explorer, Will of the Sultai, World Shaper, and then a bunch of landfall payoffs. And to be clear, you could still do some of that, especially if you're trying to up the power level of the deck. You'd still have a very unique deck on your hands. However, I have some more interesting ideas for payoffs here. Jelly Roll 153 mentioned wanting ways to stabilize life total and end up in a more mid-rangey play pattern, and a card that immediately came to mind is Primeval Bounty. This is probably the strongest non-creature spell payoff in green, but it's still a 6-mana enchantment, even if it can throw a couple dozen +1/+1 counters on a creature with the right setup, and the life gain component of the card certainly isn't insignificant, even if it's less explosive than that. My other ideas for payoffs go much further in the artifact direction. Slagstone Refinery is my favorite of these, as it can generate a tapped Power Stone token every time a Traveler's Amulet hits the yard. That mana can simply go toward casting artifacts and activating their abilities, but you could look into low-commitment mana sinks for it if you wanted. Fomori Vault is a pretty sweet utility land, Thran Spider is another Power Stone generator, and Lair of the Hydra is a land that can turn to a massive threat. For a couple other utility options, you could go for Currency Converter or Bag of Holding as funky discard payoffs. Converter is mostly just a nice ramp and filtering source, and while Bag is the much more potent card here, what exactly you'd want to do with the ability to dump 15 forests into your hand from exile, I'm not sure. Another sort of value engine would be Aetherworks Marvel, which can get some nice free spell casts once you're doing your amulet looping. If you're looking for win cons, Glaring Fleshraker could be a pretty cool inclusion as long as you have enough colorless mana to cast it often enough. As a final couple mentions, Aetherflux Reservoir and Ugin Eye of Storms are probably the strongest options here, but these are so much more powerful than the other options that they're probably best avoided unless you're taking the leap into full combo territory, which I don't think is the intention. Alrighty, those are the reviews. If you want a chance to meet and or play Commander with me, I'll be at both LDXP Tacoma in a couple weeks, as well as MagicCon Vegas in a month or so. Your chances of getting a game in with me will be much better in Tacoma than Vegas, but I still usually play a decent amount of Commander at MagicCons. Alright, bye now.